Hello everybody and welcome to this Landlord Law training webinar which is on energy efficiency and the rules and law which residential landlords have to comply with. I'm absolutely delighted as usual to have Robert Brown with us today. Hello Robert.
Hello Tessa, and hello everyone, thank you for joining us.
How we're going to do this is that Robert will talk from the slides, and then when he's finished with the slide he'll ask me to move it on, and at that stage I will ask him any questions or any relevant questions that you've asked, which you can ask in the questions box which you'll find in the GoToWebinar panel. So Robert is very happy to ask questions, though he's got quite a lot to get through, so we may have to skim through it fairly quickly. So anyway, take it away Robert.
Yes, thank you Tessa, and as Tessa says, please do ask the questions. There's a lot of material to cover, but I'm very happy to take your questions, and some of them I hope will be things that I can say that we'll be coming on to, so we may say that, but we will go through it. So yes, as Tessa says, energy efficiency for residential landlords, and what I'm trying to cover today is some of the law. Some of you may be aware that there is another webinar that Tessa did with Dave Princep about a year ago, where Dave looked at some of the law, but also a lot of the practicalities. Now, the law has changed a little bit since then, so the idea of this is to be a bit of a companion piece as to what the legislative requirements are and what the courts have said about them. And Dave's webinar I would still recommend to you, and I think we can put a link up to it somewhere, to find out what you do by way of practicalities, because I can't really tell you much about how to install double glazing and those sorts of things, but what I can tell you is what the regulations and the Act might say you need to do. So Tessa, if we can just go on and we'll have a quick look at our overview of what we're going to cover. So 4 key things that we're going to be looking at. The first 3 are the main ones. We'll say a little bit about the last one depending on time, but I think that's probably the least interesting. So we're going to start off with what is an EPC, when do you need one, and what must you do with it, which will lead into the requirements so far as EPCs are concerned and possession claims. So that's really important at the moment. Might become less so in the future for reasons that I'll touch on. And then the minimum rating that you can have for letting property. I may say a little bit at the end about a recent right that tenants have acquired to request energy efficiency improvements. Probably won't say too much about that. It's a bit complex and I've never seen anybody try and use it. So that's our overview, and if we can then just move on, I'm just going to set out. Don't worry too much about the blizzard of numbers here. These are the various sources of law. And the modern one, in fact, this actually goes back a bit before 2011, as I'll explain. But the modern starting point is the Energy Act 2011. There are a series of regulations that have been made under that. The most important of which, you'll see there, the Energy Performance of Buildings, England and Wales regulations, which were made in 2012. Those are the ones which say now when you need to have an EPC. And the Energy Efficiency Private Rented Property England and Wales regulations, which were made in 2015 and have been amended a couple of times since, once to change the date that they all came into effect, put it back a bit. We'll talk about dates later on. And the other most recently was passed earlier this year, 2019 amendment, which actually came into force at the start of this month, April 2019, which have brought a lot more properties into the scope of the regulations. Don't worry about that. We'll explain all of that a bit later on. And the assured short-hold tenancy notices regulations I'll talk about later, because those tie in with the possession claims procedure and how EPCs fit in there. So if we can just move on from that one, please. Thank you. So what is an EPC? It's an energy performance certificate, as I'm sure most of you know. And I said that the sort of modern source for this is the Energy Act 2011. And I'm sure many of you will remember that EPCs go back a bit further than that. They actually come from European law in 2002, and in the UK they came in 2007 as part of the Home Information Pacts that were introduced and ran for a few years when people were selling properties. Those were abandoned when the coalition government came in, but what they kept, as they had to, were the requirements for energy performance certificates. And you'll see these on pretty much any electrical appliance that you buy as well. You get certificates, little stickers on the front of washing machines and all the rest of it. But houses, flats, buildings can all be subject to an energy efficiency rating, which is recorded in an energy performance certificate by an assessor. And the way this works, I'm not going to get into the complexities of the mechanics of it. I think Dave talked about that a bit. What we're concerned about today are what the outcomes are. And the outcome is a score. It's a score of somewhere between 1 and 100, and then that is split into 7 bands, roughly evenly divided between 1 and 100, and those are given letters. So A is the best that you can get, G is the worst, and then B, C, D, E, F, descending order of efficiency. So A is best, B good, C pretty good, G bad, F fairly bad. So that is what we are looking at. And so far as residential property is concerned, as we will see, there is a big distinction to be drawn between E and better and F and G. E and above is good, F and G is really bad, as we will see as we move on. So that's what the EPC is, and I'm sure, I hope, that all of you will have seen one, certainly in relation to appliances and hopefully in relation to any property that you are letting out. So that's all that I want to say about what the EPC is. Yes, thank you, Tessa. Lovely, thanks. So, we know what one is. When do you need to get it? Now, there are actually 2 sources of law for this. There are the Energy Performance of Buildings England and Wales regulations from 2012, which I've already introduced, and those are the ones that I'm actually going to be concerned with. You may also sometimes, if you are doing any building work to a property, you may encounter the building regulations. There have been various forms of the building regulations since 1980s, and probably actually going back even further than that. And the current building regulations are 2010. Those will provide that sometimes when you do some work like an extension or so onto a property, it can change the energy efficiency requirements. But I'm not going to talk about those because that's a whole separate thing about buildings and construction. What we're concerned about is duties so far as landlords are concerned. And the 2012 regulations talk about duties being imposed on a relevant person. Now, relevant person is defined to mean various things, depending on whether you're selling a property, buying it, renting it out, or whatever. We're concerned here with renting out a property. And in that situation, the relevant person is the prospective landlord. And a prospective landlord has a couple of duties imposed upon them by the 2012 regulations. So the first one, Regulation 6.2 within the regulations, provides that a prospective landlord must ensure that they make available, free of charge, a valid energy performance certificate to any prospective tenant. And then if we can just go on to the next slide, Tessa, we'll see when that needs to be done. It's actually quite complicated because this is Regulation 6.2 and then sub-paragraph 2, there are 2 sub-paragraphs to it, one of which has 2 more further sub-paragraphs. So it's really quite complicated, but I've set it out there verbatim. So valid EPC has to be given to a prospective tenant at the earliest opportunity and no later than whichever is the earlier of a person who requests information about the building at the time at which the relevant person, which remember is the prospective landlord, first makes available any information in writing about the building to the person, or where someone makes a request to view the building at the time at which they view the building. So it would need to be handed out to them when they come in to look round the building, which might be a house, might be a flat, whatever it is. So that really means anybody who makes an inquiry about letting or renting out the property. But there is a bit of amelioration of that. There are a couple of cases where you don't need to do it, and we'll come on to those on the next slide if it's okay to go on to that, please, Tessa. Thank you. So, if the relevant person, the prospective landlord, believes on reasonable grounds that the prospective tenant is unlikely to have sufficient means to rent the building, so they just can't afford it, or is not genuinely interested in renting a building of a general description which applies to the building, so you think they're really just a bit of a looky-loo, or not a person to whom the prospective landlord is likely to be prepared to rent out the building, that's a tricky one, I'll come back to that, then the duty to provide them with that valid energy performance certificate free of charge doesn't apply. So if I am renting out a house at, I don't know, £5,000 a month, and someone comes along and says, I can afford £1,000 a month, I'd like to come and look round it, then I can treat them as not having sufficient means to rent the building. I don't need to give them a valid energy performance certificate.